It's spring 1981. Geoservices Canada has returned me to St. John's, Newfoundland. I was here a few weeks ago taking a survival at sea course. Flying in on this return trip, I was struck by the ruggedness of Newfoundland. The terrain seemed to embody its famed harsh weather. This was in stark contrast to my native Dorset countryside in England with its rolling hills, wildflower meadows, and comparatively balmy winters. Working with an oilfield service company, it was common for tight schedules to dissolve into hurry up and wait. This was certainly the case today. Ron, the Geoservices base manager, met me at the airport and explained that offshore operations were delayed due to bad weather and growlers. These are small icebergs that can pierce holes in ships. I was on standby to join the Pellerin, a drill ship in the Labrador Sea. I would be joining Michel, a guy I'd not yet met, to provide 24-hour mudlogging services. So with time on my hands, this was a great opportunity to explore St. John's. I remember climbing Signal Hill with Ron one afternoon, and he explained back in the early 1800s the first Lieutenant Governor of Newfoundland and Labrador had found the winter so harsh that he decreed that future governors would not spend the winter months there. We stood at the top of the hill, and the snow across the city, the biting north wind, and the flecks of white ice in the sea affirmed that winter was not yet over. On about the third day, offshore operations were starting to pick up. Early that evening, I asked Ron if he could recommend a lively pub with maybe some Irish music. "Oh, for sure," he said. "You should try O'Reilly's on George." On walking into O'Reilly's, I was struck at how quiet it was. In fact, I almost walked out to search for somewhere with a bit more life. You should understand that at this time I found Canadian draft beers to be the most unpalatable ale. In fact, I'd loud and long joked with my Canadian friends that we should not take the mixtures out of Canadian beer, because if we did, there'd be nothing left. I was incredulous at the sight of Eldridge Pope's huntsman on a beer tap badge smiling at me from behind the bar. Eldridge Pope beers were brewed just a mile away from my childhood home. Pointing at the pump handle, I asked the barman where this beer had come from. "Yup." The affirmation came right back. "A small city in England," he replied. "Dorchester." "Okay, that settles it. I'm going nowhere. This I have to sample." I spent an enjoyable couple of hours chatting with the barman while indulging in Mr. Pope's best bitter. And after a few pints, I was quite shiny. But the pub was still as dead as a doornail, and I had concluded that it was probably time to call it an evening. I should wander back to the hotel, get an early night. It was almost as if a bell rang. The place suddenly started filling up. A dozen or so people walked in. A couple of guys with guitars started setting up speakers and an amplifier in one corner, and the place started buzzing. After a few minutes, the band started playing some Irish songs that I recognised from way back: Black Velvet Band, Whiskey in the Jarro, and many others. I wandered across to the lead singer and asked him if they knew an old song by the Clancy Brothers, "Isn't It Grand Boys?" "Oh yeah," was the answer, "we can do that. You'll have to sing it though, 'cause I don't remember the words. Where are you from?" "Dorset in England," I replied. "Cool," he said, "we'll do it shortly." I returned to the bar, and after a few moments Ron popped in and came across to tell me that I'm booked on the 6 o'clock chopper for the Pellerin. Okay, I thought, it's definitely time to wind it up. I was at the point of leaving when the band started with the opening chords of "Isn't It Grand Boys?" The singers looking and pointing at me and excitedly announcing on the mic that we've got a lad from Dorset in England who's going to sing us one of our favourites. I'm now having some serious doubts about how well this is going to work out. The band, of course, are playing the intro over and over and receiving my tardiness with joyful smiles. I shook my head and headed towards the exit. Next thing I knew, I was bodily lifted onto a table in front of the band. Considering the amount I'd had to drink, I thought it went quite well. The crowd joined in the chorus. Cheers and shouts of encore followed me out of the pub door. I guess I must have asked the hotel receptionist for an early morning call and to have a taxi ready for me. I really don't recall, nor do I remember leaving the hotel, boarding the taxi or the chopper. I slept the entire flight out to the drill ship and woke to find myself sitting directly behind the pilot. The chopper was rolling a little, yawing, rhythmically rising up and down, occasionally quite sharply. While all this was going on, the pilot was contorting the joystick with one hand and quickly moving something that was out of sight with the other. I remember thinking in my bemused state, is he deliberately throwing us around, or are we being thrown around? I looked out of the window and could see the helipad rhythmically moving towards and away from us. Okay, so now I'm fully awake and I've got my eyes on both the pilot and the helipad. I have never witnessed such skill. After a minute or so as we touched down, the pilot instantly threw his arms into the air, and of course we're still pitching and rolling about. Incredible skill. I didn't feel the slightest impact of the touchdown. What a guy. As we left the chopper, we were directed below deck. After some brief formalities, I dumped my stuff off in a cabin and toddled off to find the mess. I found an empty table and sat down. This was the smartest dining room I'd ever seen on a rig. Bright, tastefully decorated, menus, tablecloths, and waiting staff too. I was seriously impressed. After a minute or two, a couple of guys entered and walked over to me. One sat down to my right, and the other immediately to my left. Feeling a little awkward, I quickly reminded myself of where I was. This is Newfoundland, and they're a friendly bunch, right? Yeah, well, maybe, but there are 5 empty seats at this table. I quietly introduced myself. Hi, I'm Philip with Geoservices. The guy to my right said, Hi, Philip, good to meet you. We've been waiting for you. I'm Shane, the ship's captain, and this is George, the first mate. And you, my friend, are sitting at the captain's table. Oh my God, gentlemen, I am so sorry. I didn't realize. I started to get up and to move away when Shane clapped a firm hand on my shoulder. No, he said. Please stay. We'd enjoy your company. There was something about his easy Australian accent that I found reassuring, comfortable with. Maybe he sounded a little like a Cockney, which was an English accent that I was very familiar with. Anyway, I was okay with his response. I started to feel less nervous. George talked a little about rig operations, and Shane talked a bit about challenges of waiting on weather and the impact of the unusually high number of growlers we were encountering. When suddenly, Shane leaned forward, almost theatrically so. He looked across to George, who was also leaning forward in a similar manner, and started talking quite loudly across me. Do you think he'd sing for us? Asked Shane. I bet he would. We should ask him, said George. Oh no. How in the feck am I going to get out of this? Almost as an answer to a prayer, a guy wearing a Geoservices t-shirt passed by our table. Michelle, I squeaked. He stopped, turned to me, extended his hand, cocked his head, and with a slightly quizzical expression on his face and in a strong French accent said, You're Philippe, right? Come on, we're over here, indicating to a table in the far corner. Oh, joy of joys. I made a pathetic excuse of having to catch up with this guy before going on shift, and made a hasty escape. As I walked away, Michelle quietly said to me, You know you were at the captain's table. Yeah, I know, and thank you for rescuing me.